Good afternoon. I hope, as always, that wherever you are well and safe and healthy. I have uploaded the most recent slideshow, which this week is on Mikhail Gorbachev and Perestroika and the Soviet Union in the 1980s. So this week I wanted to talk a little bit about that and talk a little bit about how the Soviet Union transformed, how it transformed and why it transformed in the middle of the 1980s. And the reason this is very important, the reason we need to sort of think about the Soviet Union and think about how it changed is that, as we had seen a few weeks ago when we talked about how the communist governments established themselves in Central and Eastern Europe at the end of the Second World War, we'd also established, hadn't we, that the Soviet Union was of utmost importance in the trajectory of Europe generally, but certainly of communist Eastern Europe from the end of the Second World War onwards. So what happens in the Soviet Union has great repercussions for what happens in Europe, and certainly what happens in Central and Eastern Europe as well. So we'll be talking about that. And next week, if we focus this week on the Soviet Union, then next week I want to talk about 1989, the year of transformations in Central and Eastern Europe, and talk about the end of communism. And in fact, when it ended very quickly. People had not expected, in fact, not expected the regimes to crumble as quickly as they did, but in fact they did in the space of a few months, in fact. So we'll talk about that next week. But in order to understand what happens and why that happens, we first of all have to talk about the Soviet Union. So let's do that. Now I've set up the slideshow. As always, the numbers of the slides are in the bottom right-hand corner, quite small, but you should be able to see those. So you should be able to follow when I make references to the numbers. Let's first of all have a look at slide number one. That's an image of Mikhail Gorbachev with Margaret Thatcher. I think this has been taken in 1987 or 1988. It's kind of an intriguing picture. You can see that both of them look relatively relaxed. Maybe Thatcher more than Gorbachev. It's a photo op. It's taken at one of their sort of historical meetings. I can't remember exactly which one. But it's kind of a fascinating image. If you remember when we spoke about Margaret Thatcher last week, I told you a little bit about her politics and about her attitude and about her ideas. And of course, we learned that Margaret Thatcher was pretty right wing in her politics, right wing in her economics. And if you go up onto YouTube, you can find numerous videos of Margaret Thatcher denouncing socialism, denouncing communism. She was something of a cold warrior, staunchly anti-communist, as indeed most of her party was. Throughout the Cold War, but certainly also in the 1980s. Now, for that reason, it's kind of amusing and quite strange. The chemistry, the relationship between Gorbachev and Thatcher was quite a warm one and quite a friendly one. They both seemed to get on quite well. They both sort of had a good working relationship. After Thatcher had met Gorbachev for the first time, she kind of came away and said to her cabinet colleagues in the United Kingdom, in the British government, this is a man that we can work with, that we can do business with. So it's kind of an amusing story, and I have a theory actually that people whose political divisions are already established when they meet, who are coming from different parts of the political spectrum, sometimes find it easier to get on because they already know that there are going to be differences, so they don't try to sort of change each other's minds. It's very often that the people who are from the same party or from the same part of the political spectrum who end up sort of arguing about doctrinal details or small details is something that I've kind of observed. Okay, let's move on then. With that in mind, let's move on to slide number two. This is the May Day celebration in Red Square, 1984. Always a huge parade, always carried off with huge sort of pomp and circumstance. Now, we've talked a little bit about the Soviet Union, or we've sort of visited the Soviet Union a few times in this lecture. Talked about how it came into being at the end of the Russian Civil War, how during the Second World War it became much more involved in international relations. The General Secretary of the Soviet Union, of the Communist Party, Stalin, at the end of the Second World War, being quite a paranoid person, but also being somebody who believed that the Soviet Union had been vulnerable and had been attacked during the Second World War, and that its defense and its security needed to be protected in whatever would emerge out of the international order going forwards. Established a sort of a selection, a group of buffer states, didn't he? In Central and Eastern Europe, established communist regimes, friendly regimes, which he believed would help sort of secure the security of the Soviet Union. And in Stalin's mind, he was convinced that the defeat of Germany was superficial, that the German state would rise once again, as it had done after the end of the First World War, and once again it would be a menace and a threat, particularly to the Soviet Union. And if the Soviet Union was to be protected, it needed some sort of advanced guard. And for Stalin, this was, the idea was that these states like Czechoslovakia and Bulgaria and Hungary and Romania would be able to sort of, secure a western flank for the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union was successful in projecting power into Europe. It became one of the great superpowers, one of the two superpowers during the Cold War, became a military power in 1949, organized a military pact, the Warsaw Treaty Organization, or the Warsaw Pact, organized along very similar principles to NATO. And to all intents and purposes, it looked like a very powerful state, one which could threaten the rest of the world, threaten the capitalist world. One which was militarily, economically, and politically a powerful player. Now, if we move on to slide number 3, that's an image of the Soviet leadership at the end of since the end of the Second World War. Up until 1953, as we've heard, the General Secretary, the leader of the Soviet Union, was Joseph Stalin. And Stalin's period, Stalin's rule, which really begins at the end of the 1920s and lasts up until his death in 1953, is one that is marked in the first place by terror within inside the state, mass arrests, a terrible fear of political persecution, of imprisonment, of execution, of this kind of thing. And in the second place, it's marked by the war victory. Stalin, under Stalin, the country, of course, was attacked in 1941, and then ultimately emerged as a victor at the end of the Second World War. And when Stalin died, the leadership of the Soviet Union eventually passed to a man called Nikita Khrushchev. And there had been a sort of a power struggle after Stalin had died, and eventually Khrushchev and his group emerged as the sort of the victors of this power struggle. Now, under Khrushchev, some of the most excessive parts of Stalin's state, of the Soviet Union, were dismantled. Stalin wanted to move away. Khrushchev wanted to move away from the sheer terror of the Stalin age. Wanted to bring a level of kind of normalcy to the Soviet Union. Wanted to kind of liberalize, relax the Soviet Union, and kind of wanted to distance himself from Stalin's time. Now, this he did in the most extraordinary fashion in 1956 in the so-called secret speech to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, where he stood up and in a very long speech, which was called secret but very quickly became public, denounced Stalin's so-called cult of personality, denounced many of the excesses of the Stalinist period, and essentially announced to the Soviet Union, the Soviet leadership, but to the world more generally, including the non-communist world, that the Soviet Union, under him, under Khrushchev, would pursue a different path. Now, there were limits to this so-called thaw, and initial relaxations and initial liberalizations in the Soviet Union were very quickly sort of rescinded. Although there was no sort of terror, although there was none of this extreme sort of rule under Khrushchev. This was certainly not the end of the authoritarian state, not the end of censorship, not the end of control over the rest of the communist world. Now, Khrushchev was ousted himself in 1964, and the person who took over was a man called Leonid Brezhnev. And Brezhnev ruled as General Secretary of the Soviet Union from 1964 up until his death in 1982. And his period, so almost 20 years, is known as a kind of a period of stagnation, a period where the economy is not thriving, where there's not a huge amount of change in the political setup of the Soviet Union. Things are going on as they essentially as they have done. Now, we also saw, if we turn to turn to slide number 4, we'll remember, if we come now to Eastern Europe, there had been, once the Soviet Union moved in and established these satellite states, these satellite regimes in Central and Eastern Europe, there had been some attempts at resistance. And most notably, the two most notable since the end of the Second World War had taken place in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Now, we spoke, didn't we, a couple of weeks ago about the situation in Czechoslovakia. We talked about the Prague Spring. There had been before that in Hungary also an attempt to reform the communist state, to improve its politics, to improve its economy. Things had gotten out of hand, and the Soviet Union at that time under Khrushchev became fearful that maybe Hungary would break away from the bloc. And as a result of this, they ordered a military intervention to sort of round up the non-communist elements, to round up what they called the counter-revolution, and to bring Hungary back into the fold of the socialist states. And we'd seen that happened again in Czechoslovakia in 1968. There once again a reform movement that began within the leadership of the Communist Party, quickly spiraled, seemed out of control. It looked like it was challenging the leadership of the communist state, the Communist Party, and as a result of this, the Soviet Union intervened and put an end to this reform. And then we'd seen, hadn't we, also that in the light of this, these dramatic events in Czechoslovakia in 1968, Leonid Brezhnev had introduced what became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. And essentially the Brezhnev Doctrine was saying that if one state attempted to break away from the socialist bloc, it would be a problem, it would be a concern for the whole of the bloc more generally. And it would be met with the kind of military intervention that had happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968, or for that matter in Hungary in 1956. Now, going forwards in the 1970s and the 1980s, we'll talk more about this next week. But there was really kind of a great sense of despair amongst many people within Central and Eastern Europe, having seen what had happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968, having seen how this initially very promising reform movement was crushed with military force. Many people in Eastern Europe, many people in communist Eastern Europe now believed that there was simply no hope in reforming this system, that any attempts to reform this would only get so far, and then if it got too far, if it became too successful, the Soviet Union would intervene and would put an end to these reforms. So many people simply gave up on this kind of political engagement, withdrew into sort of private life, and just said, okay, the most we can hope for is not to be sort of bothered by the party, by the police, by the Soviet Union. We just have to kind of retreat into private life, and we cannot expect that there will be any kind of promising political changes. We have to accept that this system is in force. And looking at the history, looking at what had happened in Hungary in 1956, and then looking what had happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968, most people expected that they believed that this threat of Soviet intervention was a real one, and that they had to always kind of be fearful of this, that this very powerful state, the Soviet Union, could sort of one day attack. Now, in fact, if we move forwards now to the 1980s, the Soviet Union was perhaps not as powerful as it made out, not as powerful as people believed. And the 1980s are a period, if you like, of kind of crisis in the Soviet Union, a political crisis, a military crisis, an economic crisis. And although the Soviet Union is able to project an image of power, to the United States, to the Western world, to its supposed allies in Central and Eastern Europe, the reality is that this system, this political economic system, is starting to experience a very acute, very serious problems in the 1980s. Now, many of these problems have to do with a military misadventure that the Soviet Union embarks on under Brezhnev in 1979. If we move forward to slide number 6. Now, again, this is an issue that I don't want to go into too much detail. There are some very good books and some decent documentaries on this topic, so I won't go into too much detail on this. But at the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union became bogged down in a very costly military misadventure in Central Asia, in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was on the border, of course, of what was then the Soviet Union. And the Soviets had sort of, considered parts of Central Asia to be sort of, kind of like within its sphere of influence. What happened in places like Afghanistan was relevant to the Soviet Union, was important to the Soviet Union, because this state was on the border with the country. Now, at the end of the 1970s, very complicated sort of internal political situation in Afghanistan, but the communist government, the Moscow-friendly government, was ousted, and the Soviets intervened in a very limited fashion, to try to sort of reinstall and to prop up this communist-friendly, this Soviet-friendly government. And to begin with, at least, at the end of the 1970s, the Soviet Union had hoped that their involvement in Afghanistan would be a very limited one, that it would only be a handful of military advisors, that they would not get too closely sort of caught up in what was happening in Afghanistan, and that this thing would be over, quite quickly, within a year or two. But in fact, it didn't happen like that. The political crisis in Afghanistan became a military crisis. The Soviet Union, its military presence, its political presence in Afghanistan grew bigger and bigger. And by the time we get to the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union, having hoped that it would only have a very limited military involvement in Afghanistan, finds itself in a full-blown conflict with anti-communist forces within the country, so pouring military aid into the country, pouring soldiers into the country, and really getting caught up in what's become a very serious conflict. And there are various reasons why this conflict was much more serious than the Soviets had initially believed it to be. One of the reasons, of course, is that the United States of America seeing in the Soviet Union an enemy, and seeing any enemy of the Soviet Union to be a friend of the United States, um, was pouring money into these sort of rival factions, these enemy factions within Afghanistan, in the hope that they would cause more trouble for the Soviet Union. And in fact, these hopes proved to be quite well founded. As I said, by the middle of the 1980s, the Soviet Union has a very large military presence. It's taking a lot of casualties. It's pouring a lot of money and a lot of resources into Afghanistan, and there simply doesn't seem to be an exit to this very costly war. So in many ways, it's very similar to what had happened to America a decade earlier in Indochina, in the Vietnam War, where the Americans, the U.S. Army initially believed that this would be quite a limited intervention. They started to have to pour more and more resources, more and more manpower into this conflict, and within the space of about a decade, they found that they were really kind of involved in a very costly and a very heavy conflict. So something very similar was happening to the Soviet Union, and this conflict takes place throughout the 1980s. And it's really weakening the Soviet economy. It's really weakening the Soviet military, and it's becoming a huge political problem. Now, if we turn to slide 7, we can see a succession of leaders from Brezhnev through to the mid 1980s through to Chernenko. One of the other problems, one of the additional problems that the Soviet Union was facing and was suffering in the first half of the 1980s was kind of a crisis in leadership. There were very few new ideas coming through. The very highest parts, very highest echelons of the Soviet Union, the Politburo, the very highest parts of Soviet power, were led by people who were very old, and who were very conservative, and who were very sclerotic in their political ideas. So if we start with Brezhnev, he had been in power, as we've seen, from 1964 until 1982. And within this period of almost 2 decades, Brezhnev was becoming increasingly kind of entrenched in his ideas, increasingly entrenched in his opinions, and really not offering anything new in the politics and the economy of the Soviet Union. Now, when he died in 1982, he was replaced by a man called Yuri Andropov. Andropov had been head of the KGB, but he had also been a diplomat, and in fact he had been head of the KGB during the Prague Spring. He'd been in Prague in 1968, so he had a sort of a long career in Soviet foreign policy. Now, Andropov was very old when he got to power, when he became general secretary. After Brezhnev's death, a very old man who had spent a lifetime, with long nights, working very hard, bad diet, lack of exercise, drinking lots of vodka. So he was in very bad shape physically when he became General Secretary of the Soviet Union. And indeed, he did not last very long at all. Andropov died in office in 1984. Now, he was replaced by a person who was in even worse shape than him, a man called Konstantin Chernenko, who rose to power, became the first secretary of the Soviet Union in 1984, and was really, very moribund, very ill, and barely capable of ruling the state when he came to power. And in fact, he was so ill that very often, his public appearances and this sort of thing had to be staged within the Kremlin. That he was actually bedridden. Other people were making the decisions on his behalf, and they were barely able to get this person to stand up for sort of 15 or 20 minutes so he could sort of appear in this photo op. So very old people, very old men, people who were very set in their ways, and really people who were not bringing anything new to the Soviet state. They were not offering new ideas. They were not offering radical solutions or effective solutions to these increasing problems that the Soviet Union was facing. So if you kind of see what I'm talking about in regard to problems like Afghanistan, what you have here is the Soviet Union experiencing, confronting a very serious political and military and economic challenge. The problems with the economy, problems with the political system. There is a need for drastic reform, but at the same time, you have people like Andropov, like Brezhnev, like Andropov, like Chernenko, who have risen to the top, who are very old, and who are not really offering any new and effective ideas. So they're just sort of ground into their existing ideas, and they're not offering anything sort of that could effectively be effective solutions to the problems that the Soviet Union is facing. Now, if very quickly, if we look at slide number 8, I'll talk more about this when we talk about 1989, and when we talk about Eastern Europe and the end of communism. But essentially, this gerontocracy, this leadership of very old people, very old men, with very dated ideas, and not bringing anything original or anything new to the table, was replicated within communist Central and Eastern Europe. The leaders there had also been in power for a very long time. I've got a sort of a selection of people up here. János Kádár, the General Secretary of Hungary, of communist Hungary, had been in power, since the failed reform of 1956, since the military intervention. So by the time we get to the 1980s, he's been in power for almost 30 years. Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania came to power in 1967, and had initially been seen as quite a dynamic leader who was kind of changing the direction of Romania, changing the direction of the party. But by the mid-1980s, he too had become a very conservative figure. His ideas were also not original, also very dated. In Czechoslovakia since 1969, and since the end of the Prague Spring, the Slovak communist Gustav Husak had been in power, again, as somebody who was not offering very many new ideas. And in the GDR, in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Germany, Erich Honecker had been in power since 1971. Again, somebody who was becoming increasingly set in his ways by the time we get to the mid-1980s. So these are people who had been in power for a very long time, and were not really offering very many new ideas where new ideas were needed. And these were simply exacerbating and increasing the problems that the communist world, that the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were facing. Now, if we turn to slide number 8, the situation was quite a different one in the United States of America. At the end of the 1980s, the Democratic president, Jimmy Carter, had been defeated in the presidential elections by the Republican candidate, a man called Ronald Reagan. Now, Reagan had been a show business figure, because that always works well, of course, in American politics. Putting in somebody from show business, huh? But Ronald Reagan became the president of the United States at the beginning of the 1980s. He was a two-term president who ruled America. He was American president from 1980 up until 1988. Now, Reagan was a much more dynamic figure, staunchly anti-communist, very good friends with Margaret Thatcher, and a man who immediately came into power and was talking in very aggressive and very belligerent terms about the Soviet Union, about how it was the evil empire, about how it needed to be taken on, and really kind of putting on a very tough line, suggesting a very tough line against the Soviet Union. If you skip forward to slide number 10, that's Ronald Reagan when he was a young man, opposite one of his most famous co-stars, a chimpanzee called Bonzo. And if we flip then again, more seriously, to slide number 11, I put a YouTube link to Ronald Reagan's very famous speech, where he talks about the Soviet Union, and he talks about it as an evil empire. So he's putting on a much more aggressive, much more confrontational stance, position towards the Soviet Union. Now he's also increasing defense spending. He's not just a man of words. He's very much a man of action. So he's spending more and more money on great sort of defense initiatives, on nuclear weapons. He has a very highfalutin idea about sort of arming satellites in outer space that will be able to zap Soviet missiles out of the sky. A very expensive policy which eventually never came to light. But nevertheless, kind of shows that Reagan was very serious about taking on the Soviet Union, about confronting the Soviet Union. So there's kind of a contrast, if you like, in the 1980s. On the one hand, at least up until 1985, in the Soviet Union, you have a very antiquated leadership. Brezhnev, Andropov, then Chernenko, very old men who were not offering anything new. And at the same time, you have this terrible military problem in Afghanistan, which is simply getting worse and worse and is really causing a lot of problems in the economy and in the political system of the Soviet Union. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have this increasingly sort of dynamic force in American politics. You have Ronald Reagan, who comes to power at the beginning of the 1980s and is speaking in very tough terms about how the Soviet Union is the evil empire. He's spending a lot of money on defense, which of course in turn is forcing the Soviet Union also to spend a lot of money. And so the Soviets are facing increasingly entrenched, increasingly serious problems in the middle of the 1980s. And these problems will need some kind of a drastic solution. Now, things change. If we move forward to slide 12, things change in the middle of the 1980s. After the death of Chernenko, the rise to the top of the person who rises to the top of the Soviet pyramid is quite a different figure from his predecessors. It's a man called Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, Gorbachev was a relatively young man when he came to power. When he rose to the top of the Soviet system in 1985, he was a mere sort of, I think, 52 years old. And Mikhail Gorbachev, again, a staunch communist, someone who believed, someone who had taken his degree, that had gone through the institutions of the Soviet state, school, university, risen up through the local party branches. Was very much a believer in the communist system, but was also somebody who saw that the Soviet Union was facing considerable economic and political problems, and that if it was to survive, if it was to become once again a force on the world stage, things would need to be changed quite drastically. The Soviet Union could not go on as it had been going on previously. It would need to change its economics, it would need to change its politics, it would need to change the way that the state was organized. Now, very early on in Gorbachev's reign, in Gorbachev's rule, a terrible disaster struck the Soviet Union, which really kind of shaped Mikhail Gorbachev's thinking. If we move to slide number 13, of course, I'm talking about the Chernobyl disaster, something that many of you will have heard of. Now, again, I'm not an expert in nuclear power, nuclear physics, so I would be able to tell you exactly what had happened. But in Chernobyl, there was a civilian nuclear power plant which was in a very very bad sort of state, antiquated equipment, antiquated parts. And in I think it was in April 1986, one of the main reactors, after a series of accidents, a series of sort of mistakes made by the scientists there, exploded. Now, initially a few dozen people were killed, but for Gorbachev, it was really the aftermath of Chernobyl that really kind of shaped his thinking. There was a scramble to kind of control information, to cover up what was coming out. The full facts of this disaster were not explained to people in the vicinity. They were not evacuated until a little bit later on. Very typical of the way the Soviet Union wanted to deal with these sorts of problems. And there was a sense amongst many people and amongst Gorbachev that the disaster, the tragedy of Chernobyl, had been exacerbated because of this way of dealing with the aftermath. Because information was not immediately made available, because certain parts and certain aspects of this tragedy had been kept quiet. For Gorbachev, this was part of this was sort of symptomatic of the of the shortcomings, of the problems of the Soviet Union, that it was not dealing with its problems in an open way, that it was kind of trying to cover up these things, and that this was sort of this had made this tragedy much worse. Many more people had died because they were exposed to radioactive poison and this kind of thing. Okay, now finally, we go forward to slide number 14. Mikhail Gorbachev, again, sensing that things needed to be changed within the Soviet Union, sensing that this system needed to be reformed, introduced into the Soviet system, into the Soviet state, a very radical kind of reform program. He wanted to open up a discussion about how the Communist Party might make the organization of the Soviet Union much more effective and much better. What changes might be made to politics, what changes might be made to the economy, how the Soviet people, the party, to every level, the Politburo, the central government, right down to district parties and local parties, might take part in a conversation about how things could be changed and how things could be improved. Now, Gorbachev had looked at what had happened in Chernobyl, looked at the way much information was covered up after the Chernobyl disaster, and believed that one of the problems, one of the issues why people weren't presenting new ideas, why people weren't presenting solutions to the problem that the problems that the Soviet Union were facing, was because people were not, willing, where they were too scared to kind of speak out and speak openly about the kind of things that were happening in the state. So Gorbachev said that his claimed that his policies of reform, his policies of change, would need to be conducted in an atmosphere of open discussion, and the Russian word, of course, for openness is glasnost. So the second part of the 1980s. This policy of glasnost meant, being able to speak about the problems the Soviet Union were facing, not being afraid of losing one's job, of being imprisoned, of being censured by the party for talking about its faults, for talking about its problems. And the overall program of change, the overall problem of reform that Gorbachev introduced from the second half of the 1980s onwards, was known by the Russian word for reconstruction, which is of course Perestroika. And Perestroika simply meant a very large, sort of transformation, a very large change in the politics, in the society, in the economy of the Soviet Union, so that it might better be able to address the problems that it was facing. Now, what did all this mean? There were some sort of concrete changes. At the end of the 1980s, 1988, 1989, Gorbachev announced a withdrawal from Afghanistan, acknowledging that the Soviet military presence could not go on, that it was too costly in terms of lives and in terms of financial cost. And so at the end of the 1980s, Gorbachev withdrew troops from Afghanistan. This is one big, one huge sort of monumental change. The other thing is that outside, again, we'll talk more about this next week, but in the satellite states in Central and Eastern Europe, these changes were looked with guarded sort of caution. It was not exactly clear what Gorbachev was doing. There had been periods of relaxation and periods of liberalization in the past. For example, when Khrushchev came to power, from the mid-1950s onwards, those periods of relaxation had ended very abruptly, with the military intervention, for example, in Hungary. And so it was very unclear exactly what perestroika meant, whether these changes would be far-reaching, whether these changes would be felt within the satellite states, within places like Hungary, places like Czechoslovakia, exactly what the longer-term effects, what the longer-term impact of perestroika and of glasnost would be. We will talk more about that later on next week when we talk a little bit about the revolutions of 1989. For many people outside of the Soviet bloc, so for people in Western Europe and people in the Western world more generally, the changes that Gorbachev seemed to be introducing, it was believed by many people that this would reinforce the stature and the power of the Soviet Union on the world stage. People like Reagan and people like Thatcher, they'd looked at the Brezhnev stagnation period. They'd looked at, the quick change of these very old, tired, worn-out men like Andropov and like Chernenko, and they'd sort of seen, okay, well, look, the Soviet Union is still a force to be reckoned with. But those people are very sort of, they don't have any new ideas. They're not dynamic figures. They're not doing anything sort of drastically new within the Soviet Union. When Gorbachev came to power in 1985, there was a great feeling, and particularly when he introduced these policies of perestroika, that this would make the Soviet Union a much more powerful state. That its politics would be reformed, that its economy would be reformed, that then its military would become much more powerful, that its grip on Central and Eastern European satellite states would also become much more powerful. So initially, at least, and in fact right up until the very end, in 1989, many outside observers in Western Europe, but also in the Western world more generally, believed that the policies of perestroika were going to be making the Soviet Union, a much more of a force to be reckoned with. Now, in fact, ultimately, and very much to Gorbachev's horror, precisely the opposite thing happened. The changes that Gorbachev had introduced with perestroika and with glasnost ultimately ended, the control of the Soviet Union, broke up the Soviet Union into its constituent republics, and in 1991 ended the monopoly of power for the Communist Party. It was not what Gorbachev had expected, and it was not what Gorbachev had wanted. When he began this process of reform, he had wanted precisely the opposite thing, to make the country a much more powerful place, to make the Soviet Union a much more dynamic and reinvigorated state. But once the door had been opened to these reforms, they very, very quickly took on a revolutionary character. And as we'll see next week, Gorbachev was not the kind of leader who would put an end to these problems, put an end to these transformations with a military intervention or with a very kind of authoritarian intervention. But we will talk about more. We will talk more about that in next week's lecture. So thank you.